By the same token, San Francisco has adopted CDOC as a city.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a campaign to make your city a human rights city.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's non-binding, because only the federal government can sign a treaty, San Francisco has said, we have adopted CDOC. There's a place in North Carolina that says we will abide by the UDHR and the human rights instruments. So those are good examples,
yes,
as opposed to your very scary one.
But here's a good example, just for a moment. It was in California. A piece of legislation was passed because I served on the shadow reporting team to make sure U.S. is in compliance with the CERD treaties. And in California, I can't remember
what are the CERD treaties? I don't know.
The Covenant for Elimination of Racial Discrimination.
CERD.
CERD.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they have passed a bill in California that basically requires the state offices to put up posters regarding human rights issues. These are similar to what we have, like equal opportunity laws and laws for discrimination. In California now, they can post bulletins and flyers that talk, these are human rights issues, and this is how it works. And I thought, that is great.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I thought, I've got to pull that bill out and see if we can introduce it here in New Mexico and get folks to do that.
A lot of Americans have not heard of the human rights treaties.
I know.
They've not heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
It is the
I'm an American and U.S. Americans. Why do you think this happens here? Why that,
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty. The principle of sovereignty. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, they were pushing that we join the League of Nations. They were pushing that we join the sign the UDHR. The Genocide Treaty was signed the day before the UDHR, in 1948. At the time, it looked like America was going to sign it. It was not in contradiction to any of our legal theories whatsoever. A bunch of ABA lawyers, conservative lawyers, got to the Senate before a vote and said this is a threat to our sovereignty. And so that same argument comes up with CEDAW and CRC, the rights of the child. They go back to that. And states' rights is a big problem in America. Yeah. The senators and the Congress people say, oh, that's the federal government having too much power over what we do at home and in our states. So this whole principle of sovereignty, you talk about geopolitics, is a huge issue in international relations. And human rights is the challenge to sovereignty. Human rights elevates the individual above the state. And sovereignty, the Westphalian principle of 1648, makes the state the ruler over the individual. Now that's becoming challenged with genocide becoming such a public awareness. Not that genocide didn't happen before the treaty, but because we're so anyway, it's this tension between idealism, saying, hey, we need to protect each other, we need to have individual rights, we need to cross sovereign lines to protect others, and this idea of saying, no, you can't. Bashir, was that the president of Sudan? He's the one that said, you can't come in. You can't come in because of the sovereignty principle.
And this is something that is a historical marker for the United States. The Federalist discourses, they never were resolved. We like to historicize it, we always like to think that everything has been resolved once it's become constitutionalized or there's some sort of document. But this discussion epistemologically has taken place. And now we see what some people are calling, Paul Romer calls this, supra-anti-federalism. So it's states like Arizona saying, I'm not subject to what the United States tells me. And therefore, I'm also not subject to what anybody else tells me outside of the world either, including nations. So it goes from state to national to international very quickly. And the sovereignty is really localized. It's an extremely localized behavior. But I did want to acknowledge a point that Dr. Cagas made about cities. Cities are an institution now that have become far more mobile, agile than nation states in attending to diplomatic issues, to foreign relations issues. We're now seeing this discussion about the charter city being a far more robust discussion about how people deal with issues of human rights, but also with economic development issues. If you look at the discourses on the creation of the Olympics and how the Olympics is actually administered, it has very little to do with countries. I mean, it is really city-organized type of behavior, and it really demonstrates really the mobility of cities in the 21st century. Trujillo, Honduras, if you're looking at a city now that is starting to rise beyond what is going on within the national politics, which is very scary in Honduras. Trujillo, in fact, is actually emerging and growing very much like Hong Kong did in the 1970s and the 1980s. So there's another institution there that we're paying attention to, San Francisco, with its acknowledgement of human rights and all the different types of documents that it's willing to sign on to is evidence of that.
Just, to further add to this discussion, you mentioned the triangular trade a few moments ago and you talked about human rights. And when you look at the history of that in America, again, you realize that many people of African descent were actually talking about human rights from the 1700s up until about 1930 or so. They were always talking about human rights, but somehow that conversation shifted from human rights to civil rights. And so that's become the primary discourse in this nation right now. And it's my, looking back and analyzing as a child of the 60s also too, you realize that when people like El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King started talking about human rights, that's when they really became dangerous, a threat to the system. This is when they were murdered. And so that's kind of pushed that back under the carpet again. And you didn't hear about human rights again on a national level until Jimmy Carter became president and started talking about it a little bit more. So we still have a long way to go in bringing this discourse to this country about what it means, and that dignity and justice is for everybody, not just those who can afford it.
And during 1948, the NAACP, the African Americans really tried to get Eleanor Roosevelt to talk about human rights and not civil rights, and she dissed them. She really let them down. And they very much tried to take a case to the UN and say our human rights are being violated, and the United States government just wouldn't let that happen. They wouldn't let them adopt the language of human rights. It's always been the language of civil rights. And because for America, human rights means civil and political. We sign the civil and political documents. We do not sign anything that has to do with economics. I've heard American diplomats say this, they say this out loud, those are aspirations, they're not rights. The right to have fair wage is just an aspiration, it's not a human right. The right to health care, it's not a right, it's an aspiration, and on and on and on. So we have a fundamental shyness against economic rights.
And civil rights in the U.S. has really become about property. You look at a lot of legal journals and things, you'll see that when people are discussing civil rights, they're talking about property. So you can take your own conclusions from there, really.
Yeah. I want to take a step back now, and we've identified a lot of really wonderful material, but I also want to open it up to other stakeholders in the room. And I know many of you came here to discuss the impact maybe of the politics of identity, women's rights, indigenous rights. Is there anybody else that would like to chime in on institutions they've been thinking about, or different ways in which conflict minerals can be the definition or the way that we're understanding the institutional map or the topography of conflict minerals? Is there anything that you would like to suggest or offer?
Or even ask.
Yeah. Earl?
I guess just concerning the way kind of the UN has defined it in a way through Security Council Resolution 1857, they look more at the region rather than specifically identifying conflict minerals. It's case-based, I guess. And I think that's important to consider, just because saying that specific minerals are conflict minerals is very hard to do, especially in situations like DRC, being as coal in a lot of situations there becomes a conflict mineral just because of how it's developed and extracted and everything around that. So I think it's important just to see that rather than blankly saying like the 3 T's, diamonds, gold, these specific minerals are conflict minerals, depending on how they're extracted. I know we've looked at De Beers and seen that they've kind of shaped up diamonds in a way and cleaned up the act of how that's being done, that we not just blankly say certain minerals are conflict minerals and more case-based, region-based. This area is more likely to result in conflict minerals of any sort. Just the commodities coming out of that area are naturally more prone to becoming conflict minerals.
But you want to distinguish between, you want to keep oil out of it?
No, because I mean, that goes back to my thing of when do we talk about a strategic resource, oil, uranium, versus a conflict mineral?
Because you sound like you would include oil in your type description.
Depending on the area, I guess that's what I'm really saying, is that you can't just say oil is a conflict mineral. It depends on the region it's coming from and how it's being extracted in that region.
I don't know what the definition of mineral is. Does oil count as a mineral?
I guess at some level it could, yeah.
I didn't-
Yeah, I think at some level it could.